Welcome to The Cynical Developer, the podcast that helps you to improve your development knowledge and career through explaining the latest and greatest in development technology and providing you with what you need to succeed as a developer.
In this episode, we're joined by Jim Basilio and we talk about Angular 2. Jim has been a developer for over 20 years. He has worked with .NET, C# for 10 years and Java for most of the rest. He's dabbled with C++ as well as other assorted tech. During his career, he has worked with AngularJs from early versions up to its current form. He's currently working as an architect for a finance company, and in his spare time, he is an avid Unix geek and has been using Linux since 1995. So welcome to The Cynical Developer, Jim.
Thanks for having me, James.
Not a problem. It's good to have somebody on to come and talk about Angular. We've talked about React, possibly got somebody lined up to come and talk about Knockout and a few of the other platforms. It's good to get all the sides of the arguments for these different frameworks. So we'll start off with what is Angular 2?
Sure, yeah. Hopefully I don't start any online wars and can do Angular some justice. So Angular 2, there's sort of a lot to unpack. It's a framework. It's not just a templating library. Some of the other tech that you mentioned does one thing in the MVC star space and it does it well. Angular tries to sort of be the whole framework, but something that you can write an application right out of the gate with, and you can use other libraries, but you don't necessarily have to. So what Angular 2 is it's a rewrite of Angular 1 from Google. Google authored Angular 1, and what they did was they looked at some of the problems with Angular 1, some of the performance issues that happen as you scale an application up over time, and they looked from the ground up and also looked across at what other technology was doing. Namely, I think a lot of the influences for this generation came from React and the one-way data flow. So Angular 2 is something that they build a foundation here and they intend to use this foundation over time. So Angular 1 largely thrown away. Concepts are similar in some ways. Across, some of the design decisions are different, but from a conceptual perspective of a component and a controller, there's some analogies there. But now that Angular 2 has been out, Google's actually trying to downplay the name 2. They're saying that this is Angular. It was the 2.0 version. We're going to release the next version, which actually, ironically, is called 4.0. They're skipping 3 because of trying to stick to semantic versioning. But it's the same foundation in Angular 4 that is in 2. It's just a semantic versioning change because there's backwards incompatibilities. But in terms of the guts and the guts intended moving forward, it's the same foundation. And what Angular 2 is it's a single-page application framework. So it's something that includes all that's needed to write a single page. If you think of a single-page application as something like a application for your phone, where you open it up, you click some buttons, move around, routing within the application is sort of how you can think of those button clicks. That's what a single-page application is, and that's really what the Angular framework is. So like I said, it's a full MV star framework. It has all the pieces in there. It also includes other foundational pieces like a unit testing framework. This is called Karma. It allows mocking. If you've ever used JUnit or NUnit in C# or Java, it has similar pieces where you can mock a behavior out of a dependency. So if I call a network call and to receive some JSON in my Karma test, I can mock that out and return back a junk JSON payload. And then that way I can have tight unit tests that don't cross domains. It also includes an integration testing framework, which is called Protractor. So this is something that integrates with Node and then also has some hooks through Selenium so that it can run against multiple browsers. So Protractor's a neat, unique way that Angular delivers something that is quite different from the other frameworks in that it has integration testing built in. And then one of the other bigger pieces that Angular has is a dependency injection framework. And this is something similar to Angular 1. It's a different dependency injection framework than I'm used to from things like Spring. I also used one called Unity on C#. And these were dependency injections that were broad. So you put things into what I mentally think of as like a bag of dependencies. And then when I needed one, I injected it versus newing it into my component. Angular 2's dependency injection is hierarchical, and I'll get into the hierarchy of Angular in a little bit. Also, there's a routing piece that's included in Angular. With this is swappable. There's multiple implementations out there, but the one that's built into Angular is wired deeply into the Angular framework. And this allows me, as I click a link, I can go to the router and say, what component does this load in? That'll load a component into like a div, essentially, into my application, and then start that component. So Angular 2 is really this web component framework. So there's other component frame standards that are emerging. Angular 2 is at its heart a web component framework. If you think of your root node, when you go to your index.html and Angular boots, that first component that you start is your root node, and then there's a tree view underneath of that. There's a hierarchical exposition of your application. So my root node is my top level node, and then if I had a left div and a right div under that, and they were both Angular components, then they would separate and be peers on that level. If my right div had a table on it, then that would be a child of my right div, and so on. So you have this tree view, and you could actually sort of whiteboard out your application as a series, as a tree of web components and how they stitch together. And that's really the key piece of Angular, is that hierarchical view. It allows a one-way data flow from the root node down to all the components. If something changes, then on any of my nodes in my application, then the event bubbles up to the top of my root node and then flows back down again for the change detector. And this is one of the ways that Angular 2 changed from Angular 1, because it's that one-way data flow. Every event fires through the root node and down through all the components. Whereas Angular 1, when I would set, let's say, a binding, if I had an input box and I typed foo into that input box, I'm going to bind behind the scenes to my controller that new value. And then in Angular 1, a digest loop would fire and essentially communicate all the changes everywhere in my application. So in some ways, that was reminiscent of like a jQuery approach, where one change on some node over here on the right broadcasts up over my entire application, and then those pieces update themselves, which then in turn can cascade to another digest loop firing. So Angular 1 got into this digest loop trouble, where every binding in my template would cause all this rippling throughout the application, and it kept rippling and rippling and rippling until the digest loop stabilized. Whereas, and then in Angular 2, if we think about that component tree again, one change in my input box broadcasts to the top node. It fires through all of my children components, and when it's done that one pass, it's done. So in Angular 2, you get one pass to stabilize your application. In Angular 1, you had God knows how many passes. It just depended on how many watchers you had. So that was a lot of stuff to unpack, but Angular 2 as a framework and as a design has quite a bit going on, even though I think when you take it all away, it's actually quite a bit simpler.
Sure. So it's a huge difference to what we are used to with Angular. It's something that's it's changed a lot. So as well as the tooling that's there, I guess the language has changed. If somebody is already familiar with the original Angular, is it different for them to get involved with it? Are they going to be looking at writing the same Angular syntax, or is it completely different?
It's pretty different. However, a lot of the design names are similar. So in Angular 1, you had a dependency injector. It was just a global injector, and the syntax was a little bit different. For example, in Angular 1, there were 3 different ways to create services to put into the dependency injector. In Angular 2, there's just one. So there's a lot of simplification that came with Angular 2. Components are now the name that you use for your containers for a web component, whereas in Angular 1, they were called controllers, and you had directives. And directives were a bit dense in terms of the syntax. Every time I needed to look at a directive or write a directive, there were lots of different tokens that you would use depending on how you wanted to pass information into it. And they were very difficult to look at. Components are very simple. Components have inputs, and the inputs are the way that the components communicate with the outside world to get information in. And then components have outputs, and outputs are the way that it notifies that something changed and that other people that are interested can be aware. So that component model, inputs and outputs, that's really the basis for it. So it's pretty straightforward. And it is different than Angular 1, but Angular 1 was no walk in the park when it came to syntax. I think people got used to it over time, but it's one of those things that you're more used to than maybe it was intuitive.
We mentioned there that it was more of a full framework than the likes of React and stuff. So it's not really comparable to those anymore. It's, I guess it's an all or nothing framework now.
Yeah, you can. So one of the beautiful things about Angular 2 is that you can integrate it with pretty much anything. Angular 1, because of that digest loop and how it did the binding, made it very difficult to integrate. So when I did Angular 1 and we had something like a jQuery control, if some data changed, or if I wanted to invoke a jQuery control and it changed data internal to it, Angular 1 had no way of knowing that because that wasn't part of Angular's digest. It wasn't part of what Angular was watching for its templates. So you had to tell Angular 1 that something changed and pump the digest loop manually. With Angular 2, excuse me, they have something called zones, and zones are wiring that allow it to detect changes. So it detects events. If I make a network call, that's an event. If I something changes in the DOM and there's an event that fires from there, I can detect that as well. And then that top level flow from the root component down occurs. So you can, and actually one of my teams did have React integrated inside their Angular 2 application for a while. Initially, they had started React and then migrated to Angular 2, and since then, React has been removed. But it does actually integrate cleanly. But the differences with Angular 2 compared to those other ones, so React, Backbone, Knockout, and any of those other libraries, is they tend to focus on one of the pieces of MVC. Mostly it's the view. And in there, they do what they do. But Angular really sees the whole application as that single page application and less as just one of those layers.
So we touched on there using Angular with the likes of jQuery. Now, the first version of jQuery was known to be a bit of a pain and not play nicely with others. Is that still the case with the new version?
Yeah, so Angular 1 had the digest loop, and anything that happened within an Angular 1 namespace within the JavaScript that ran would be detected by that digest loop, and then the page would be adjusted to bind back to the model. With Angular 2, with Angular 1 and binding to that model, what would happen was anything outside of that digest loop, like a jQuery event or anything else that was not within the what was going on within Angular, it didn't see. So you had to sometimes manually pump that digest loop to make Angular essentially bind to the changes that have happened around it. With Angular 2, and one of the core pieces of it is called ng-zone. And with that ng-zone wrapper around every one of the Angular components, it can then detect any of those changes going on. So when it sees something happen in jQuery in a DOM event, it'll then fire the change detector down through that hierarchical component tree, and then all of the components will resync to what's happened behind it. So it actually integrates quite nicely with jQuery. We're using jQuery on my project. One of the groups was using React, and it worked fine with that. We also use a tool called Widgmo, and we haven't had any issues with things picking up changes. So it works fine with pretty much everything out there that I've seen.
Okay, that's really good. We talked as well about Angular being an all or nothing. It's a full framework for building the entirety of your application. Now, when I used Angular 1.4, I built that within an ASP.NET MVC application. Is that less the case now that it's more geared towards building a single application within Angular itself? You don't really use it with the likes of ASP.NET. You would really just talk to the services that you produced.
Yeah, so with MVC Frameworks now, it's sort of two different MVC frameworks. You have your backend MVC or whatever else you want. You could just take the database, load it, and return it in JSON. But the backend is thought about as its own thing now. It really focuses on getting data and storing data. Whereas the front end, the Angular piece, is the full MVC framework on the front end. So it's running completely in the browser. And while you could serve this piecemeal, so you could have your HTML served from the back end in pieces, and then it would run in the browser, the problem with that is Angular actually has sort of a runtime, if you think of it. If anybody's done Spring, when you start Spring up, it pulls in all the beans, it wires things together with dependency injection. It's the same thing that Angular's doing. So there's sort of an overhead with the Angular boot up, if you want to think of it that way. And then once it's up, there's no more overhead. It's got all the components there. It's just sort of loading them in and out of the DOM and rendering things. But you wouldn't want to really shift the Angular runtime in and out of memory just because of that overhead. So the MVC framework really focuses on the browser, and then you can make all your decisions similar to the back end. So it's kind of an evolution in my mind. When you had MVC on the back end, you thought about your design differently. It wasn't about pages on the back end. It was about how do I separate my services? How do I separate my data layer, my view layer? Well, the front end now has those same kinds of, I'll call them grown-up computer science concepts, where I can think about how to best expose my services and isolate things, keep solid principles. How do I separate out my view so that I can reuse these components across views, reuse my router? So it becomes a much more framework that you can design against, as opposed to just thinking about pages in there on an island, and then how to stitch those together as an application.
Okay, so it's more of a fully rounded platform now, and you're not really relying on ASP.NET to do your front end or anything like that.
Right, not at all. And even just as an aside, because it's sort of grown up a little bit, I have a person on my team who had only done back end development, and he obviously was aware of how the web worked and HTML and things, but he hadn't really done deep JavaScript development. But because of the ways that Angular 2 has brought in and even Angular 1, but because of how Angular 2 has isolated out components and things, it was something that he took to very easily, because the boundaries are very well delineated, the component models delineated, and it's something that gave him a basis, some sense of grounding. Whereas things in the past with jQuery and styles and style sheets and how it all worked together, there was a bit of dark magic, it always seemed like, in getting pages to function. Now it's a much more ordered, opinionated in some ways, but well-designed way to develop applications.
Sure. So 1.4 and previously with Angular, you would write all your applications in vanilla JavaScript. Is that still the case with the new version, or can you use the likes of TypeScript with it?
Yeah, you can write it in ES5, which is sort of what most people that did Angular 1 wrote their applications in. ES6 has brought some improvements to the language, classes, different things like that. And I'm not an expert on ES6, because I sort of went from ES5 right into TypeScript. And that, in my mind, is really the preferred way to write Angular code. Some people don't like that you have to go through a compilation step. They'd rather write right to the browser. But you get a lot of niceties with the language itself, TypeScript. And so when I think of Angular 2, I think of the surface area of the API, all the things I've talked about, but I also think about TypeScript and the tool chain, something that Angular CLI makes easier. Because having a big team, or even a small team, in my opinion, with something like TypeScript, where you have now static types, strings, dates, numbers, and the compiler that's going to help make sure that if you change the name of a key in a JSON structure, that's going to compile for your entire application and tell you where you broke something. Whereas if you're using ES5 or ES6, then that's going to tell you broke something if you have a unit test. Otherwise, it's going to break at runtime. So to me, Angular plus TypeScript, and then tooling like Visual Studio Code and Angular CLI, are really where all of this comes together in a way that makes it feel like I have a team that's working on a language that has a compiler, that has unit tests. It's sort of the way I was used to on the server side when I was doing that development more. And I really prefer that as I get into application development on the front end. So it's changed a lot of how applications are developed for me. It's a much stronger paradigm.
Yeah, it seems that Angular now is less a single tool just to manipulate your data on the front end, but it is everything. I guess you should look at it in the same way that you do look at Microsoft's MVC or web forms, and that you're going to do everything that your project needs really in Angular. It's not just that nice little framework that helped you before.
That's exactly right. It's not just a templating library. It's not just a simple way to query the DOM, but instead I'm actually designing my front end. I'm designing reusable components. I'm designing something called pipes in Angular, where I can flow data through it like a date and say, I always want it to appear this way in this format. And they're pieces that are isolated. And when you put them together, you can reuse them across the application. It's just a stronger design and a framework, whereas before we were really focused on pages. It was something like React, where you had JSX files and sort of JavaScript and templates are interleaved. There's separation of concerns now within Angular, and I think that a lot of people that have done server-side development are going to look at this and feel at home. I know I have, much more so than in the past, when again I sort of got into that dark magic of style sheets and selectors and all of these sharp corners that I always felt like before. This is a much easier environment for I think most people to take to once you get over the learning curve and maybe even the paradigm shift.
Yeah, we've said that it covers everything and it sort of touches on everything that you need. Does that have any impact on what CSS frameworks and that you could use? Are you still able to use the likes of Bootstrap with it, or does it come with its own sort of framework to use?
Yeah, Angular 2 doesn't have any kind of styling to it directly. They're redoing the material design style sheet, but that's not released yet as far as I'm aware. I think they've been working on it for a while and they wanted Angular out and stable before they put more work into that. So that's from the Google team. My team is using Bootstrap 3. Bootstrap 4 would work fine. Anything really would work fine because it doesn't care about your styles. It just cares about the DOM, the data in the DOM, the HTML itself, and you can style things however you want.
Okay, fantastic. It runs from what I've seen of it from Node. You use Node.js to install it, and there was a lot of files when we installed it in our team. Is that the case, or is that us just being a little bit noobish and not installing it properly?
Nope, no, you got it. Angular 1 in the past was distributed, I believe, on NPM. It was I had used it through Bower, so just these package management tools. Right now, as far as I'm aware, the only way you can get Angular is through NPM, and I think that's sort of a consolidation that the industry has seen anyway. Bower's somewhat gone at this point. Certainly it'll be around for a while for anybody using it, but NPM is really where all of the JavaScript packages are starting to consolidate. So you would download Node, which gets you NPM, and then you would do an NPM install of Angular 2, or you could get the Angular CLI, and then that'll pull the rest down for you. And it is a hefty download as far as the raw library and the tooling, but when you ship it, it's not something that has that heft associated with it. It's really just the framework itself, and then as you use the application and compile it to what you'll essentially run in your from your web server, it's a much smaller distribution there.
Right, I think that was maybe the step that we were missing, was the compiling it down after the fact that we've developed it, because I believe my senior developer at the time who was looking at it said that there were several thousand files there, and we didn't really want to distribute them. And you think, is my user going to have to download all of these files? But I guess if you're running the compilation, that it removes those ones that you don't need or you're not using.
Yeah, there's nothing different than you did in the past. So in the past, if let's say I had a jQuery application and I had 1,000 different HTML files and 1,000 different JavaScript files, I could certainly distribute them one by one. But in the past, what we would have done is a grunt or a gulp or something like that, where I essentially bundle everything, minify it, compress it, do whatever I want after the fact, to where I have one application file that I'll then distribute. And Angular 2, especially with the CLI, Angular CLI integrates with a tool called Webpack. Initially, or early on, it used System.js, but they migrated Angular CLI to Webpack. In my project, I actually use System.js. But if you're using the CLI, you're going to get a Webpack build chain. So when you run a build of Angular, it's going to take all of the template files, all of your JavaScript, any styling you have, and it's going to bring all that together into one or a handful of pieces that then the user would download. And there's one extra step that the CLI does. You could do manually as well, but it's called tree shaking. And tree shaking is an interesting, I think from just a picture in your mind of what happens is, if you think about all the different pieces that get pulled into this one piece that the user is going to download, and then you start shaking the pieces, what it does is it crawls through your code and looks for what you've used in a library and what you haven't. So let's say the reactive.js library, RxJS, that's a huge library. I think it's at least half a meg of a download if you included everything. But if I, through my imports in TypeScript, only import 3 of the functions, through tree shaking, what it's going to do is essentially remove the rest of the library and only include those 3. So for a full application for Angular, I'm sure it can get as large as it needs to be, but no larger. But for something like a Hello World, there's a blog, Minko Getchev, he did a Hello World application, and from his numbers on his blog, he says that an unshaken application, I believe it was 1.5 megs or so, but after he went through the tree shaking, it went down to 50K. So it's one of those things that it It only needs to be as big as it needs to be, as long as you're importing what you need and you use something like the CLI or do the tree shaking manually. But it'll get as small as it needs to be based on what you've used.
Sure. Now, are there any applications that you would say, if I was looking to build something, that Angular wasn't the tool or anything like that? Because now it does everything. Are we at a point where we could overuse it to do all our different applications?
I think if you have an application that has routing, so you have some kind of table of contents and you're moving around and you want to load components dynamically into sections of your site, if it's one sort of cohesive application, one mental model for your application, what you're trying to do, I think it fits Angular really well. If you're just trying to put pages together and they're just sort of pages on their islands and you just need to bind some data into it, it may be overkill. However, a lot of the tooling that you get with unit tests, integration tests, you're going to end up, or you may end up needing to do that anyway, and in which case you're going to have to decide and go out and say, what are the best of breed out here that I can figure out what to use? So it probably is overkill for very simple page-based applications, but in my experience, and I'm more of an enterprise developer, it fits the mold a lot in terms of the kinds of things you're going to do if you're fetching CRUD applications, the things you're fetching from the database. It really fits that mold very well.
We've spoken as well that now there's unit testing in Angular. Is that specifically just for Angular, or can we use that as a standalone product?
It uses, so the tool is called Karma. Karma, the reason you need something in Angular to help you is because of things like dependency injection and the other pieces that Angular adds. Under the covers, it's using Jasmine, which is a unit testing framework library language that others use as well. And you could use that just fine with Angular, but you're going to then need to start the Angular environment, put the dependencies in that Angular is going to inject, the mocking, all those kinds of behaviors. So what Karma does is and the same with Protractor. Protractor is using Selenium and essentially other best of breed pieces out there, but it puts wiring that's Angular specific that sort of grease the skids for how you want to, what you would end up having to do yourself. So they've taken base tools that everybody has maybe used in the past if you've done unit testing or integration testing, and they've added things to fill the gaps on what Angular needs to get the Angular runtime running, so that then you can just focus on your tests.
If you wanted to learn more about Angular, have you got any good training courses, any websites, any blogs or anything like that you'd suggest for myself and the listeners to go and have a look at?
Yeah, the Angular team has a tutorial on angular.io. If you go to that website and you look for the Tour of Heroes tutorial, there's lots of good documentation. I think they've done an excellent job on documentation itself. So you can go to angular.io and check out the tutorial and then other things, useful pieces there. There's also a book that I purchased called NG2 book, ng-book.com/2, and that's specifically written for Angular 2. These guys actually wrote this book and adapted it for every change in the beta, the release candidates. They've been adapting over time, and this has been an excellent book. So the NG Book 2 is definitely something I would recommend people purchase. It takes you through an application development, lots of different pieces, a Twitter client. It's real good.
Cool. We'll get all those linked up in the show notes for anybody who wants to go and follow those up. Now we're just about out of time, so I'd just like to thank you for coming on and explaining Angular 2 to us, or AngularJs as it's now going to be known. And thanks very much.
I had a great time. Thanks a lot, James.
Yeah, not a problem. You've been listening to The Cynical Developer. I'm James Stoddart, and you've been listening to Jim Basilio talking about AngularJs.
If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on your favourite podcast platform and help The Cynical Developer to grow by increasing its audience. If you have any questions about this or any other episode, then drop us an email, a tweet, or leave a comment on the website, where you can find all the resource links and show notes for each episode.